June 24th, 1944. Normandy hedgerow country, 3:47 a.m. The German panzer mechanic kneels in mud that smells of diesel and death, his wrench frozen mid-turn on a Tiger tank's drive sprocket. Somewhere beyond the bocage walls, an engine growls, not the deep, methodical rumble of Wehrmacht armor, but something different, higher-pitched, relentless. Multiple engines, perhaps a dozen, maybe more, their sound layering into a mechanical symphony that shouldn't exist at this hour, in this sector, at this impossible speed. He presses his ear to the ground, an old cavalryman's trick, and feels the vibration through his jawbone. They're moving, fast. The kind of fast that violates every principle of armored doctrine he learned at Grafenwöhr. By dawn, his entire repair battalion will have retreated 17 kilometers. Not because they were overrun, but because the front line simply ceased to exist where it had been marked on yesterday's map. 48 hours earlier, Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr.'s Third Army had officially entered the war in France. Within a week, his armor would advance further than any mechanized force in military history, a pace that would turn the carefully prepared German defense in depth into a mathematical impossibility. But the true shock wasn't merely speed. It was the collision of two entirely different philosophies of war, two conceptions of what machines could do and what men could endure. The German engineers, trained in the proud tradition of precision and calculated force, found themselves confronting something their training manuals had never predicted: American logistics moving faster than German thought. The Wehrmacht entered World War II with the finest armor doctrine on earth. Their officer corps had studied Guderian, had internalized the principles of Schwerpunkt and Bewegungskrieg, had conquered Poland in weeks and France in 40 days. Their tanks were mechanical marvels, the Panther with its sloped armor and devastating long 75mm gun, the Tiger with frontal plating that could shrug off most Allied rounds. When German engineers designed a tank, they built a masterpiece, each component precision machined, each tolerance calculated to the millimeter. A Panther required 55,000 man-hours to produce. Quality over quantity, strength over speed. They expected the Americans would fight the same way, carefully, methodically, with long pauses for supply consolidation and tactical regrouping. After all, the U.S. Sherman tank was demonstrably inferior on paper. Thinner armor, a smaller gun, a gasoline engine prone to catching fire. The Germans had even given it a nickname, Tommy Cooker, for the way British crews burned inside them. 5 Shermans for every Panther, the math went. Acceptable losses for the defender. The Americans would batter themselves bloody against prepared positions, exactly as they had at Omaha Beach. But Patton didn't play the game they had studied. On August 1st, 1944, the Third Army began what would become Operation Cobra's exploitation phase. Within 72 hours, Patton's lead elements had penetrated 40 miles into Brittany. Not 40 miles of cautious advance with consolidated flanks, 40 miles of pure forward momentum, leaving bypassed German garrisons to wither on the vine, in Patton's phrase. His columns moved 20, sometimes 30 miles per day, every day, in a continuous rolling offensive that gave the enemy no time to establish defensive lines. German intelligence officers stared at their map overlays in disbelief. The markings couldn't be right. No army moved like that. Not with supply lines stretched across cratered French roads. Not while fighting. But the maps were accurate. The secret wasn't in the tanks themselves, it was in everything behind them. A German panzer division in 1944 required roughly 300 tons of supplies daily to maintain offensive operations: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food. Complex items like transmission gears or engine blocks had to be requisitioned through proper channels, manufactured to exact specifications, transported by rail to forward depots. If a Tiger threw a track deep in enemy territory, recovery meant bringing up a special 40-ton half-track, there were only 3 per division, and towing the beast back to a repair facility. Time-consuming, resource-intensive. Doctrine stated that a mobile defense required periodic pauses to allow logistics to catch up. Patton's Third Army consumed 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day at peak operations, not 800,000 gallons stockpiled carefully at secure depots, 800,000 gallons moving forward in a continuous river of fuel trucks, jerry cans, and improvised pipelines. When a Sherman broke down, crews simply abandoned it and took another from the reserve column that followed every spearhead. There were always more Shermans. The American war machine had produced 49,234 of them by war's end versus 6,000 Panthers. When ammunition ran low, P-47 Thunderbolts dropped belly tanks full of gasoline directly to forward positions. When French roads proved too narrow, combat engineers bulldozed new ones through the hedgerows within hours. The German engineers began to understand they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an economic system on tracks. One captured German after-action report, recovered near Le Mans, records the bewilderment in clinical language. Enemy columns advance without regard for exposed flanks or supply line security. They appear to possess unlimited motor transport and fuel reserves. Our attempts to cut their supply routes have had negligible effect. They simply establish new routes within the same day. The psychological effect on our troops is severe. They report American tanks appearing in sectors we had calculated could not be reached for 48-72 hours. Psychological effect. That sterile phrase conceals a truth the German command struggled to accept. Their soldiers were experiencing the collapse of their understanding of warfare. A veteran panzer crewman from the Eastern Front knew how war worked. You identified the enemy's Schwerpunkt, concentrated force, smashed through, exploited, then paused to regroup while the enemy fell back to his next prepared line. War was a rhythm, a dance of thrust and counter-thrust. Patton's Third Army didn't dance. It steamrolled. There was no pause, no rhythm, just pressure everywhere, constantly. By August 8th, Patton's armor had covered 200 miles in 7 days. The German 7th Army, caught between British forces pressing from the north and the American torrent from the west, began collapsing into what would become the Falaise Pocket. German engineering officers, men who had built the Atlantic Wall and maintained panzer divisions across 1,000 miles of Russian steppe, found their carefully laid plans meaningless. They would identify a river crossing that absolutely must be defended. It was the only place American armor could ford for 20 miles, and begin fortifying it only to learn that Patton's engineers had already thrown a pontoon bridge across an impossible site 5 miles south, and a column of Shermans was already through. The Americans brought their logistics with them. Every tank battalion had organic maintenance companies that could swap out an engine in 4 hours. Every infantry division traveled with enough spare parts to rebuild its vehicles twice over. Radio communication, which the Germans had pioneered, became an American advantage simply through scale. Patton could coordinate 5 divisions in real time, while German commanders were still waiting for motorcycle couriers. But it was the fuel that haunted the German engineers most. Gasoline, petrol, that liquid freedom that allowed armies to move. Germany had fought the entire war under chronic fuel shortage, synthetic plants struggling to replace the oil fields they'd never captured in the Caucasus. Panzer divisions allocated fuel by the litre, calculating every kilometre. When Rommel's Afrika Korps ran out of fuel at El Alamein, the battle was effectively over. The panzers sat immobile, magnificent gun platforms that couldn't maneuver. Patton's tanks burned fuel prodigiously. The Sherman consumed 1 gallon per mile on roads, worse cross-country. And yet they never stopped. A German intelligence estimate from late August calculated that the Third Army's fuel consumption should have outstripped Allied supply capacity by mid-month, forcing a halt. Instead, the advance accelerated. The Americans were bringing fuel across the Atlantic faster than they could burn it. An entire ocean served as their supply line, and that ocean was an American lake. On August 31st, the Third Army reached the Meuse River, a 400-mile advance in 1 month. Then the fuel really did run out, not from lack of supply, but from the sheer length of the logistics chain, finally exceeding even American abundance. Patton's division sputtered to a halt, and for a brief moment German commanders dared hope that the laws of war had reasserted themselves. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The Wehrmacht in France had been shattered beyond repair, not through superior tanks or tactics, but through an enemy who had fundamentally reimagined what logistics made possible. The Americans had turned supply into a weapon more devastating than the 88mm gun. Years later, captured documents would reveal the depth of German miscalculation. A Panzer Lehr Division engineer's diary recovered from a field hospital contains a passage dated August 10th. We were told the Americans were shopkeepers and factory workers who would crumble under professional military pressure. But these shopkeepers have brought their factories to France. They don't fight like soldiers. They fight like a nation that produces more than it can possibly use and has decided to bury us under the surplus. Every tank we destroy, 3 more appear. Every supply dump we raid contains more food than our battalion has seen in a month. They're not better warriors. They're something we didn't prepare for. They're richer, and they've made that wealth mobile. The symbolism crystallized around something mundane. The jerry can. The Germans had invented it. A brilliant piece of engineering, the Wehrmacht's canister, a 20-litre fuel container with a brilliant cross-shaped indentation that allowed expansion without bursting and 3 handles for easy carrying by 1 soldier or 2. The British and Americans had copied it immediately, producing millions. But while a German panzer company might have 50 on hand, carefully accounted for, Patton's columns abandoned thousands by the roadside, empty, used once, and discarded, because bringing back empties wasted transport space better used carrying full ones forward. German troops picked them up gratefully, marveling at the waste. That casual abundance, the ability to treat precision-engineered equipment as disposable, represented everything the German engineers had failed to factor into their calculations. They had built better tanks, they had trained superior crews, they had mastered the tactical art of armored warfare, and none of it mattered against an enemy who could field good enough vehicles in limitless numbers, keep them fueled, and never stop moving. The gap between Meuse and Rhine, from September 1944 to March 1945, gave the Wehrmacht a final few months of defensive war. But France was gone, lost not in a Napoleonic climactic battle, but in a sustained rolling collapse. The German engineers who survived would return home to a nation that had always prided itself on quality, on craftsmanship, on the superiority of the well-made thing. They had been defeated by mass production and logistical indifference, by an enemy who could afford to be wasteful because waste was cheaper than precision when you controlled half the world's industrial output. In the end, Patton's great achievement wasn't speed for its own sake. It was the demonstration that in modern war, the factory floor determined the front line. Democracy and capitalism, those abstract concepts the Wehrmacht dismissed as bourgeois weakness, had translated into steel and gasoline, moving faster than fascist efficiency could respond. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece. The Sherman was merely adequate, but adequacy multiplied by 50,000 and fueled by an ocean.